Episode 1. The Note That Shouldn't Exist. They told me that every hymn in the church had a name, a history, and a composer who had once bent over parchment, bleeding ink into music that would survive centuries. But that night, inside the old chapel of San Aurelio, I heard a hymn that had no author, and it has never left me since. It began so simply, one note, soft and trembling, floating like dust through candlelight. I remember looking around, expecting to see the choir raise their books, yet no one moved their lips. The congregation shifted uncomfortably, each man and woman certain they had not sung a word. Still, the note swelled, richer, deeper, until it shaped itself into a melody that none of us could deny. I should have left then. I should have run. Instead, I listened. The hymn filled the nave with a gravity I cannot explain. It was not joyous like the Gloria, nor mournful like the Requiem. It was hungry. Each verse climbed like hands on the rungs of an invisible ladder, pulling us upward, demanding surrender. By the second refrain, the people around me began to hum without knowing why. Their faces slackened, their eyes glassy, their throats trembling with sounds they swore were not their own. Father Esteban, our priest, turned pale. He slammed his book shut, but the sound echoed uselessly beneath the roof. "Silence!" he cried. "This hymn is not ours." Yet the command was swallowed whole. The voices surged louder, layered upon each other until the rafters groaned as if the church itself had been forced to sing. I felt my own chest vibrate, my lungs strained against me. I clamped a hand over my mouth, but still, the melody forced its way out through my teeth. It tasted of iron, as though every note carried blood. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it ended. The silence that followed was worse than the music, a silence so thick it pressed against the skin, demanding acknowledgement. One by one we blinked, as if waking from a shared dream. No one spoke. No one dared. We shuffled out of the chapel into the cool night air, our ears still ringing with something that had no right to exist. The next morning I asked my neighbor if she remembered the melody. She shook her head violently, insisting she had heard nothing unusual. Yet as she closed her door, I could hear her faintly humming the first note under her breath. That was the night San Aurelio changed. The hymn had entered us, carved its way into marrow and memory. And though no one admitted it, every single one of us knew the same terrifying truth. We had sung a hymn that no one wrote. Episode 2. Voices Without Choirs. I did not step foot in the chapel for 3 days, and yet every night, as the town's lamps guttered out and the streets of San Aurelio folded into darkness, I heard it, the hymn. It came faintly at first, carried by the wind like the echo of something far away. Then, as the clock struck midnight, the sound grew bolder, fuller, until it seemed to spill through every shuttered window. People whispered that the choir had begun rehearsing at strange hours, though anyone who had walked by the church knew the doors were locked, the building empty. On the fourth night, curiosity overcame fear. I went. The chapel loomed at the end of the narrow street, its wooden doors chained shut. Yet from within came a harmony so clear, so flawless, it felt as though the walls themselves were instruments. My hand trembled as I pressed it against the stone. Yes, it vibrated, pulsing with invisible throats. Then something stranger still. I recognized the voices. Maria's alto, deep and trembling, the brittle tenor of old Joaquin, the thin, clear soprano of little Estella, the girl who sold flowers outside the bakery. They were all there, united in perfect rhythm, singing a song none of them knew. But when I glanced toward their homes across the square, I saw their windows lit, their shadows moving. They were not inside this chapel. So who was singing? I pressed my ear to the door. The hymn surged higher, and with it another sound, breathless, ragged, as though the choir was not simply singing but straining against something unseen. Their notes twisted upward until they became a cry, a plea, a warning. I staggered back, heart hammering. The hymn ended on a single drawn-out note that felt less like music and more like a scream. The silence that followed cut deeper than any blade. And in that silence, the chains on the chapel doors rattled. Not from wind, not from touch, but as though something inside had pressed against them, longing to be free. I did not wait to see if they would hold. I ran. The next morning, Father Esteban stood in the square, his hands raw as if from pulling at something unholy. He told us not to speak of the hymn, not to listen if it came again. But I saw the hollow look in his eyes, the tremor in his fingers. He was afraid. And when the sun set that evening, San Aurelio grew quiet. Each family huddled inside, praying in whispers. But when the clock struck midnight, the hymn returned, stronger, clearer, crueler. And this time it was not only voices I heard, it was something else, something beneath the voices, something waiting. Episode 3. The Silent Organist. By the third week, San Aurelio no longer slept. Mothers clutched their children through the night, men kept candles burning until dawn, and the priest wandered the square with eyes red from prayer. Still, the hymn came, faithful as the toll of death, weaving its way through walls, through locked doors, through trembling hearts. Then one night the hymn was not just voices, it was music. The chapel organ had been silent for years, its pipes rusted, its keys untouched. No one in the village played it anymore, and yet, as the clock struck 12, the hymn rose with the weight of that forgotten instrument, the pipes roaring like a storm in the nave. I was there. I had dared to stand in the shadows just outside the church, unable to keep myself away. The moment the organ began, my blood froze. The doors rattled. The stained glass windows pulsed with light, though no fire burned inside. And above the voices of 1,000 invisible singers, the organ thundered. I swore I could see the keys moving through the cracks in the door, pressed down, one after another, as though unseen fingers ran across them with purpose. But it wasn't just sound, it was command. Each note seemed to bend the world around it. The trees bowed, the lamps flickered, even my knees buckled, as though gravity itself bent toward that dreadful song. I forced my hands over my ears, but it didn't matter. The music wasn't entering through sound, it was inside me, crawling, insisting. Then above the harmony, a whisper, not sung, not played, spoken. "Come closer." I staggered forward, feet moving against my will until my forehead pressed against the wooden door. My breath fogged the cold iron chain, and through the crack I glimpsed movement. Not a person, a shadow. The figure sat hunched at the organ, its head bent, its hands black as soot running over the keys. Each movement was deliberate, furious, as if the creature's very existence depended on pulling sound from silence. But when the hymn surged to its highest note, the figure turned, slowly, mechanically. It had no face, only a hollow, gaping absence where a face should have been. I fell backward, choking on my own scream. The music ceased instantly, as if cut by a blade. The organ fell silent. But the worst came after. I returned home, trembling, certain no one would believe me. But as I passed the houses of my neighbors, I saw it. Every single one of them, asleep in their beds, their lips moving, their throats pulsing. They were singing the hymn in silence, dreaming it in unison. And I understood then, the organist had not needed a face. The organist had found its choir. Episode 4. The Hymn in Their Dreams. I thought I could escape it by refusing to sleep. I sat by the window night after night, candles dwindling to stubs, eyes raw and burning. But when exhaustion finally claimed me, I learned the truth. The hymn does not wait for the night, it waits for the mind. The first dream came gentle. I was standing in the chapel, empty pews bathed in gray light, the organ silent. Then I heard it, soft as breath, the opening note. I turned, expecting to see Father Esteban or one of the choir, but there was no one. And yet, my own mouth opened, my own voice answered. I awoke gasping, the taste of iron thick on my tongue. My throat ached as though I had been singing for hours. The next day, whispers filled the village. Neighbors confessed that their dreams, too, were no longer their own. Old Joaquin wept in the square, insisting that his dead wife had stood beside him in the dream, singing. Young Estella said she heard verses no one had ever spoken aloud. And when the priest demanded silence, demanded we resist, I saw the terror in his eyes. Even he was not free. That night, the dream deepened. I stood among hundreds, no, thousands of villagers, though San Aurelio had never known so many souls. Faces I did not recognize, dressed in centuries-old garments, swayed in the pews. The organist sat hunched at the instrument, faceless, its fingers never faltering, and every throat, living and dead, sang the same terrible hymn in one endless harmony. I tried to shut my mouth, to refuse the sound, but my body betrayed me. My lungs filled, my voice soared, and the song tore itself from me like flesh from bone. At the hymn's peak, the dream warped. The chapel walls melted into blackness, the floor dropped into void, and still we sang, choir without end. Faces dissolving, bodies fading, until only the sound remained. When I woke, I was on the floor of my home, fingernails cracked, lips bloodied. My neighbor stood at my door, trembling. She whispered, "We all dreamed the same hymn." And for the first time I realized the truth. The hymn did not belong to San Aurelio. It had no borders, no time. It was weaving us into something larger, something endless. Now, when the clock strikes midnight, I do not fear the chapel's doors, nor the organ's roar. I fear my own sleep, because in dreams, there is no escape. And every night I feel the hymn digging deeper into me, as if one day when I finally cannot wake, I will sing forever. Episode 5. The First Death. It happened on a Sunday. The bells of San Aurelio rang, calling us to Mass as they always had, though everyone walked slower now, wary of what lingered in the air. The hymn had become a shadow over us all, never spoken of aloud, yet present in every silence. The chapel was crowded, more than usual. Perhaps we hoped that being together would make the fear smaller. Father Esteban's voice trembled as he began the service. He prayed louder than he ever had before, desperate to drown the memory of the song. For a time it worked. The air was heavy but still. No organ, no unseen choir. Just the priest's words, steady, fragile. And then it began. One note. It did not come from the rafters or the shadows. It came from a man in the front pew. His name was Raphael, a farmer known for his quiet devotion. His head tilted back, eyes rolled white, and his lips shaped a melody that none of us had ever taught him. The hymn. People gasped. Some cried out. His wife clutched his arm, but he did not stop. The sound poured from him, pure and unstoppable, as if something inside had broken loose. The pew beneath him shook as others began to hum against their will. I felt it rise in my own throat, that same cruel vibration clawing to escape. Father Esteban slammed his hand against the altar. "Stop this," he commanded, but his own voice cracked into a half-sung note, betraying him. Raphael's body convulsed. His voice soared higher, carrying the hymn beyond human breath, beyond human limits. Blood trickled from his nose, then his ears. His chest heaved, veins straining, as if the song demanded more than flesh could give. And with a final piercing note, he collapsed. The chapel froze. The hymn ended with him. Silence drowned the air, but it was not peace. It was horror. Raphael lay on the floor, eyes wide, mouth open as though still singing, but no sound came. His wife screamed his name, shaking him, begging him to rise. But his chest was still, his lips were stained red. We carried him out together, though no one spoke. The villagers avoided each other's eyes. For how do you bury a man killed by a song that no one wrote? That night, the hymn returned, stronger than ever. And woven into its harmony, I heard something new. Raphael's voice. The dead had joined the choir. Episode 6. The Choir of the Dead. We buried Raphael the following morning. The sun was pale, the earth damp, and the villagers dug in silence. His wife clutched a rosary so tightly the beads cut her palms. Father Esteban refused to sing. He read scripture instead, hurried, as though he feared even the prayers might twist into something else. We laid Raphael into the ground, lowered him into the soil. The moment the earth struck his coffin, the wind shifted. It carried a note, faint but clear, drifting over the fields. It was his voice. Some villagers cried out. Others fell to their knees, but the sound did not stop. As dusk fell, the hymn rose again, soft at first, then swelling into harmony. And though Raphael had been the only one buried that day, the voices in the air were many. The dead were singing. That night, no one slept. From every corner of San Aurelio, the hymn swirled like a storm, coming not from the chapel, but from the very soil. It was as if the graves themselves had become mouths. Children whimpered beneath their blankets, and the old clutched crosses until their knuckles turned white. Yet still, the hymn invaded every home. I could not resist. I stepped outside. The square was filled with people, all staring upward, faces pale in the moonlight. Above us, the air trembled with voices I recognized. Voices of the long gone, my grandfather, Joaquin's dead wife, Estella's mother, who had been taken by fever years before. They sang as though no time had passed, their tones woven into that same dreadful hymn. Then came Raphael. His voice soared above the rest, raw and new, bleeding with the freshness of death. I covered my ears, but it made no difference. The sound was inside me, rattling my bones, forcing my own throat to move in answer. I bit my tongue until I tasted blood, desperate to hold it back. Across the square, Father Esteban fell to his knees. His cry was not prayer, it was despair. "They do not rest," he shouted. "God help us. They do not rest." And in that moment I understood. Every death fed the choir. The hymn was not only sung by the living, it was building something greater, gathering voices one by one, weaving both flesh and spirit into its endless song. The night ended, the hymn faded, but dawn brought no comfort, because now the graves of San Aurelio no longer held silence. They held music, and each of us knew that when our turn came, we too would sing, forever. Episode 7. The Forbidden Verse. By the 7th week, Father Esteban had grown gaunt. His sermons were short, his hands trembled, and his eyes wandered as if he searched for something invisible. Still, he would not abandon us. He said there must be a source, a root to the hymn's power, and that if we found it, perhaps we could sever it. One evening, he summoned a handful of us into the chapel. The doors groaned as he dragged them open, their hinges rusted with silence. He led us down a narrow stairwell beneath the altar, a place few had ever seen. It smelled of mildew and earth, of prayers too long forgotten. Torches lit the crypt. Bones lay in alcoves, skulls stacked like trophies of time. But it was not the dead that Esteban sought. It was something older. At the far wall of the chamber, the stone was not smooth. It was carved. I saw it then, faintly etched into the rock. Not words, but symbols, lines and curves that mimicked musical notes. A hymn written in stone. Older than ink, older than parchment. Father Esteban's torch shook as he traced them with his hand. These are not Latin," he whispered. "Not scripture. They are verses that should not exist." The markings seemed to hum under the flame's light, as if the rock itself remembered sound. Esteban pressed closer, and his lips moved. Without meaning to, he was sounding out the shapes, breathing them into syllables. The moment he spoke, the air shuddered. The hymn answered. The crypt filled with a low, rising chorus, not from above, not from the village, but from the walls themselves. Dust fell from the ceiling. Bones rattled in their alcoves, and I felt my chest constrict as though the stone wanted to pull the breath from me. "Stop!" I cried, grabbing the priest's arm. But Esteban's eyes had rolled back, his voice lifting into a rhythm that matched the symbols. It was the hymn's missing verse. A verse that had never been sung in San Aurelio, yet had waited, carved in silence, for someone to give it life. When I tore him back, the sound broke. The crypt fell silent. Esteban collapsed, gasping, his hands bloody from clawing at the stone. We dragged him up the stairwell, out into the cold air. The moment we emerged, the bells in the chapel tower rang of their own accord. No wind stirred them, no hand touched them. Their chime carried across the valley, and with each toll, I felt a verse burn itself deeper into my memory. The hymn was no longer incomplete. It had been waiting for someone to find the forbidden words, and Father Esteban had just given it breath. Episode 8. The Child Who Knew the Ending. After Father Esteban uncovered the verse, San Aurelio grew heavier with dread. The villagers avoided the chapel, yet the hymn seeped into every shadow, every silence. We no longer asked if it would return, we only asked what it wanted. The answer came from a child. Her name was Inés, no older than 9, with dark eyes that had once shone with innocence. But one morning, her mother brought her into the square, pale and trembling. Inés had begun to sing in her sleep, not the familiar notes we all feared. No, she sang something different, something none of us had ever heard. The villagers gathered, unwilling, yet unable to resist. Inés stood barefoot on the cobblestones, swaying gently as though rocked by an unseen hand. Her lips parted and a melody poured out. It was the hymn's ending. The sound clawed at my bones. It was not resolution, not peace. It was a descent, a spiral into something vast and merciless. Each note stripped the air of warmth, leaving the square brittle with silence between her breaths. Dogs whined, roosters fled their coops, and the bells atop the chapel shivered without wind. Her mother tried to shake her, to hush her, but the child's voice carried on, strong and unwavering. What terrified me most was her expression. Her eyes were closed, but she smiled as though she knew a secret the rest of us had yet to face. When she finally opened them, the song still hovering in the air, she whispered words no child should have known. "It is finished," when we are all inside. The villagers recoiled. Father Esteban stepped forward, clutching his crucifix so tightly his knuckles split. "Who taught you this?" he demanded, voice cracking. Inés tilted her head, and for a fleeting moment her small voice was not her own. It was layered, as if 1,000 singers spoke through her throat. "The hymn taught me," her mother screamed, pulling the child to her chest, but it was too late. We all had heard it. The final verse. A verse that did not end the song but promised its completion, when every living voice, every dead whisper, every soul bound to San Aurelio would join the endless choir. That night, no one dared sleep, but still across the village children hummed in their beds, their mouths moving without consent. Parents wept quietly, pressing pillows over their ears. And somewhere in the distance, faint yet clear, Inés's voice threaded through the hymn, leading it, guiding it toward its dreadful conclusion. We understood then, the hymn was not merely haunting us, it was recruiting us, and it had chosen a child to show us how it would end. Episode 9, The Exorcist Who Couldn't Sing. When the Vatican finally answered San Aurelio's desperate letters, we thought salvation had come. A black car arrived at dusk, its windows dark, its tires crunching over the stones of our empty square. From it stepped a man in a plain cassock, tall and gaunt, his eyes deep as wells that had never seen light. His name, he told us, was Father Silvano. He carried no fear. While the rest of us whispered of shadows and voices, he walked into the chapel as though it were any other house of prayer. "The church has silenced many demons," he said, his voice steady. "This hymn will be no different." We wanted to believe him. That night, the square filled with people clutching rosaries, hope flickering weakly in their eyes. Father Silvano stood before the chained chapel doors, Bible in hand, his voice ringing through the air. He began the rite of exorcism, his Latin sharp, precise, commanding. For a moment the silence held, and then the hymn answered. It rose like thunder from within the church, shaking the stones beneath our feet. The torches flickered, the chains rattled, and suddenly every voice in San Aurelio froze in their throats. The hymn was not only inside the chapel, it was inside us. Father Silvano pressed on, shouting over the melody. "Exorcizo te!" he roared, but the words bent, twisted in the air. By the second verse, his voice cracked. By the third, his prayer was gone. In its place, the hymn. His lips moved without permission. Latin gave way to the cursed melody, syllables twisting into sounds no human tongue should shape. He staggered, clutching his throat, trying to force scripture out. But no matter how hard he strained, the hymn poured through him, smooth and relentless. We watched in horror as the exorcist, the man sent to banish the darkness, became its loudest instrument. His voice rose above the invisible choir. Strong, terrible, carrying the hymn with a power none of us could resist. Some villagers fell to their knees, singing with him, their tears streaming as though they knew their will had been stolen. And then he screamed. The sound split the night, tearing the hymn in half for a single merciful instant. His body arched, blood seeping from his ears. He collapsed before the chapel doors, the Bible still clutched in his hand. The hymn fell silent. We rushed forward, but Father Silvano was already gone. His eyes stared skyward, lips parted in a frozen note, a note we all recognized, because when the hymn returned, stronger, fuller, more dreadful than ever, his voice was in it. The exorcist had not silenced the hymn had silenced him. Episode 10, The Hymn in Stone. After Father Silvano's death, San Aurelio no longer dared hope. The Vatican had sent us a warrior of faith, and the hymn had swallowed him whole. Now, each midnight when the song began, people no longer prayed for silence. They prayed simply to survive until dawn. But the hymn was no longer content to live in voices. It wanted walls. I noticed it first while walking past the chapel at dusk. The old stones, worn smooth by centuries of weather, seemed darker, damp. I leaned closer, and my stomach turned. From the cracks in the wall seeped a thin line of crimson, trickling down like sweat. The smell was unmistakable: iron, salt, the scent of blood. Then I saw it. The streaks were not random. They curved, joined, split again. Lines forming bars, stains arranging themselves into the shapes of musical notes. A score was bleeding itself onto the chapel walls. That night the hymn began earlier than midnight. The moment the sun sank, the air quivered with low, vibrating tones. I ran to the square and found others staring at the chapel. The walls pulsed faintly, as though each stone were a lung drawing breath. The blood notes gleamed, wet and red, glowing in the torchlight. And then the walls sang. The sound did not come from inside, but from the stone itself. Every brick, every seam between mortar, every bloodline etched with notes. Together they vibrated, creating a harmony so deep the ground shook. People clamped their hands to their ears, but it was useless. The hymn bypassed flesh, echoing straight into marrow. I fell to my knees, and in that instant I saw visions. Armies kneeling, empires crumbling, oceans roaring, all swept into the same endless chorus. The hymn was older than San Aurelio, older than Rome, older than Scripture itself. And now, it was no longer just a song. It had a body, carved in stone and fed by blood. Father Esteban staggered into the square, his crucifix raised high. "Do not look, do not listen," he cried. But even he stared at the walls, trembling, his lips moving against his will. The hymn pulled at him like a tide. By dawn, the blood had dried. The walls were still again, but the notes remained, etched into the surface like scars. A score carved by something far older than human hands. Now each evening new lines appear. The hymn is writing itself upon the chapel, piece by piece, bar by bar. And when the score is complete, when every wall drips with its music, San Aurelio will not hold it anymore. Episode 11, The Night of One Voice. It began without warning. No bells, no whispers of midnight. Just a single sound that burst from San Aurelio all at once, as if every chest, every throat, every mouth in the village had been seized by the same invisible hand. One note. I was wrenched awake by it, my body rigid, my lips trembling. The sound tore itself from me before I even knew I was breathing. And when I stumbled outside, I saw the truth. Every villager stood in the square, faces lifted to the sky, their voices locked together on the same impossible pitch. Children, elders, even the sick who had not left their beds in weeks, all were there, all were singing. The sound was unbearable. A single note stretched beyond what lungs should endure, yet no one faltered. The earth quivered beneath us. Shutters rattled on windows, and the chapel itself glowed faintly, as if feeding on the vibration. I tried to stop. God knows I tried. I clamped my hands over my mouth, bit down on my tongue until it bled, but still the note poured from me, smooth and merciless. I looked at my neighbor, her eyes streaming with tears, her hands clawing at her throat, yet the sound went on. We were no longer individuals. We were one voice. The mountains answered. Echoes rippled across the valley, carrying our note into the darkness. Birds fell silent, dogs whimpered, and then the ground split with a deep groan, as though the very earth recognized the hymn and trembled in reply. And that was when the figure came. Through the haze of moonlight at the edge of the square, something stirred. Not a man, not a shadow, but a presence. Its shape shifted, blurred, as if made from smoke and light woven together. With each step it took, the note grew stronger, harder, until I thought my chest would burst. It did not walk toward us, it walked through us. As it passed, people collapsed to their knees, their bodies quaking, yet their voices never broke. I felt it brush against me, cold, endless, hollow, and for an instant I understood this was no hymn of worship. This was a summons. The figure raised a hand, black, shapeless, and the note cut off. The silence after was so sudden it felt like drowning. We gasped, clutching our throats, blood at our lips, our lungs burning as if we had been singing for hours. The figure did not speak. It only turned toward the chapel, its faceless head tilting, as though studying its own creation written in blood on the walls. Then it was gone. But the silence it left was not empty. It was pregnant, waiting. We knew then the hymn was no longer a song. It was a mouth, and something had finally begun to step through. Episode 12, The Composer Who Never Lived. After the night of one voice, San Aurelio was broken. The villagers no longer spoke of escape. Where could we go when the hymn lived in our blood? Instead, we lingered in silence, as if any sound might awaken it again. It was Father Esteban who found the clue. He had locked himself in the rectory, poring over crumbling ledgers, ancient songbooks, archives long forgotten. His hands shook as he carried them into the square one evening, spreading them across the steps for us to see. "There," he whispered, pointing to a name scrawled in the margins of a centuries-old hymnal. The name was Tomas de Alvar. Beside it, in faded ink, were fragments of notes, bars that resembled the cursed melody we had all been forced to sing. According to the text, Thomas had been the composer of Canticum Nullius, the hymn of no one. A murmur rippled through the villagers. We had found the author, a man to blame, a man whose sin had birthed our torment. But when Esteban searched deeper, the horror came. There were records of every choir master and composer who had ever written for San Aurelio across the centuries. Every baptism, every burial, every debt. But there was no Tomas de Alvar, no family, no birth, no death. The name appeared only in that one book, nowhere else in any history. "It is not possible," Esteban muttered, tearing through the pages, his voice breaking. "Every soul has a place in the archives. Every soul leaves a trace, but this man never lived," someone whispered. The words sank into us like ice. If Tomas de Alvar had never drawn breath, then who had written the notes? Who had carved the verses into the crypt stone before Esteban had been born? Who had etched music into the walls with blood? That night I dreamed of a man whose face I could not see, hunched over parchment, quills scratching furiously across the page. His hands moved too quickly, the ink never running dry. He paused only once, to look at me, though he had no eyes. When I woke, the taste of iron lingered in my mouth, and on my bedside table in my own hand were words I did not remember writing. "Tomas de Alvar lives when we sing him." I burned the page, but the truth was already carved into me. The hymn's composer had never lived, because he did not need life to exist. He had us. Episode 13, the hymn that erased names. It began with the photographs. Maria came screaming into the square one morning, clutching the frame of her wedding portrait. We gathered around, and when she turned it for us to see, the air froze. Her husband's face, once proud, bearded, smiling, was gone. Not blurred, not faded. Gone, as though he had never stood beside her at all. Only Maria remained, smiling at a space of emptiness. That night others noticed it too. Family portraits, school records, headstones in the cemetery, all of them missing names. The hymn was not only killing, it was erasing. We tested it. I went to my grandmother's shelf, where a black and white photograph of my uncle had sat untouched for decades. His face was gone. When I asked her about him, her brow furrowed. "I never had a son," she whispered, though I remembered the funeral with my own eyes. Panic gripped us. We began to list names aloud, desperate to hold them. But as the hymn returned that night, one by one, those names slipped from our tongues. We could recall faces, gestures, even voices, but the names vanished, eaten by the song as surely as flesh by fire. Father Esteban was the first to admit it aloud. The hymn does not want memory. It wants silence. It wants to be the only thing left to call. And then came the worst discovery. Inez, the child who sang the ending, stood in the center of the square, humming softly to herself. Her mother called her name, once, twice. The woman's face twisted in terror. She couldn't remember it. Neither could we. The girl looked up, her dark eyes knowing. "It's easier without names," she whispered. "Soon, we'll all be only voices." By dawn, 4 villagers were gone from records entirely. Their houses still stood, their belongings still lay scattered, but their family lines, their photographs, their very histories had been rewritten. It was as if San Aurelio had never known them. Only those of us who had heard the hymn remembered, and even that memory slipped like water through our hands. I write these words in secret, carving names into wood before they vanish from me. But even as I do, the letters blur. My hand stutters, and I forget who I am writing for. Perhaps soon, I will forget myself too. Perhaps that is the hymn's true purpose, not to kill, but to replace, to strip us of identity, of history, of all things but song. A village without names, a people without memory, only a choir. Episode 14, The Last Verse in Blood. By then, San Aurelio was no longer a village. It was a choir pit. We walked the streets with hollow eyes, our voices trembling even in silence, as if each throat was preparing for the next verse. But the hymn had grown impatient. It began with Esteban. He staggered into the square one dawn, clutching his cassock, his chest heaving as though he had run from fire. His hands trembled as he tore open the fabric, and the crowd gasped. Across his skin, carved into his flesh as though by invisible quills, were notes, a verse. Blood still dripped from the lines, yet the cuts were clean, sharp, deliberate. Not wounds of violence, but of writing. Music written on his body. He fell to his knees, sobbing, "It is writing itself on me. It is finishing." By nightfall, others bore the same marks. Children, elders, even I. I woke with pain searing down my arms, and when I lit a candle, I saw them. Notes etched into my skin in perfect symmetry, crimson lines spelling melodies I had never known. The pain was unbearable. Yet when I pressed a cloth against the blood, the markings remained. They were not wounds, they were scripture, and the hymn read us. When midnight came, our bodies sang. Not our mouths, not our lungs, our very skin. The notes carved into us vibrated, bleeding light, spilling sound. The air around us shimmered with music that was no longer sung but lived. Every verse from the chapel walls, every stolen name, every dead voice, all converged, and from our flesh the hymn drew its final chorus. Some clawed at their skin, desperate to rip the music away. But the more they tore, the louder it became, as though the hymn rejoiced in our despair. Inez, the child, stood in the center, her body glowing faintly with red script. Her small voice rose above it all, calm, steady. "This is the last verse," she said, her tone almost gentle. "When the writing is finished, we will be finished too." And still the notes spread, across our backs, our arms, our faces, living scores etched in blood, binding us into something greater, something endless. By dawn, the walls of the chapel and the skin of the villagers bore the same melody. The hymn no longer needed parchment, stone, or air. It had written its last verse on us, and we were no longer people. We were pages. Episode 15, The Hymn That No One Wrote. I no longer remember the sound of silence. There was a time when San Aurelio held laughter, whispers, arguments, prayers. Now only the hymn remains. It does not wait for night. It does not wait for sleep. It is constant, like breath, like heartbeat. We do not speak anymore. We sing. Even when our mouths are still, the notes vibrate beneath our skin. The melody coils in our marrow. And when we close our eyes, we see it. The endless score, written across us all. Every bar filled, every verse complete. I thought the end would come like thunder, some final explosion of sound. But no, the hymn does not end. It consumes, slowly, patiently, until there is nothing left to resist. Last night I looked in the mirror and saw that my own face was fading, not disappearing as the others had, not erased, but dissolving. Features blurring into lines, lines into notes. My reflection was no longer mine. It was music written in flesh. I tried to pray, but the words reshaped themselves into melody before they reached my lips. And in that moment, I understood. I had never been the one telling this story. The hymn had been telling it through me. Every word, every confession, every memory I carved into these pages. It was all part of the song. I have sung the hymn in full now. I did not learn it. I did not choose it. But it is inside me, as it is inside all of San Aurelio, as it is inside every voice that dares to listen. And perhaps even now, as you hear my words, you feel it too. A note, faint at first, tugging at the edges of your memory. A hum you cannot place, a tune you do not remember learning. Do not follow it, do not give it breath. Because once you sing it, you will understand what we have come to know. The hymn was never written because it was never meant to end. It only waits for new voices, and now it waits for yours.
Epilogue, the listener's verse. If you have reached these words, it is already too late. The hymn has no author, no origin, no end. It survives only by being heard, carried from ear to ear, from breath to breath. Every story told about it, Every whisper, every memory scratched into paper, these are its notes. And now, yours too. I can feel you. As you read, your pulse begins to falter, aligning with a rhythm you cannot name. Your chest tightens, though you tell yourself it is nothing. But listen closely. Beneath the hum of your own body, there is another sound, a faint vibration, like a choir warming its throat. It has noticed you. Perhaps you thought you were safe, that this was only a tale, words on a page or a voice in the dark. But the hymn does not care what you believe. Belief is irrelevant. It only needs a listener. And you have listened. Soon, when the night is quiet, when your thoughts drift and your defenses fall, you will hear it, one note. Soft, impossible to ignore. You will tell yourself it is the wind, or the pipes, or the floorboards. You will lie to yourself, but your lips will part, your throat will move, and you will join us. Do not ask where San Aurelio is now. Do not ask who survived. There is no village, no priest, no graves. Only the hymn remains, written on stone, written in blood, written in the marrow of every voice it claims. It is writing on you even now. Read the last line aloud if you dare. Give it your breath. Give it your place in the choir. Because that is how the hymn continues. That is how it will never end. And when you sing, you will understand.